Hello there. Today I'm going to review a movie that I saw on the weekend, Exodus: Gods and Kings. Now, I should preface this review with the assertion that I consider myself to be a Christian, and thus my interpretations and perceptions of this film will inevitably be informed by those beliefs. I want to make that transparent. However, this does not necessarily mean that I am one of those devout religious folk who walk into a film such as Exodus expecting to be theologically offended or something like that. I have noticed that when a Bible story has been touched upon by a commercial or, Hollywood organization, something like that, it can be easy to play the role of the Christian cynic. Well, this isn't quite how it should have been portrayed and that sort of stuff. I gotta say though, director Ridley Scott must have been at least somewhat aware that he would be grabbing the attention of these religious folk by producing this film. As for the most part, Exodus: God and Kings is strangely pretty safe. A majority of this film proceeds very close to the original text, with only a few outliers here or there. With this, Ridley escapes a percentage of potential backlash that he might have received otherwise. Yet, without even looking at it from a theological stance, just as me personally as an avid moviegoer, this movie is a pretty hollow retelling of the renowned Bible story. The emotional connection and the raw spirituality, it's just not inherent to this movie. Oddly enough, the most emotional scene for me personally was when Ramses first comes across his dead son. Why am I feeling sympathetic for him? He's supposed to be the main villain, right? Earlier I said this film is playing it safe with the religious crowd, but I also think it attempts to appease the secular audience, getting the best of both worlds kind of thing. Ergo, this is not a depiction of a loving, reflective God as contemporary Christianity advocates. Rather, there is nothing really spiritual about the character of God in this film, oddly enough. Instead, he is portrayed as a snobby, wrathful child. Seriously, every time we spoke to Moses, I couldn't help but feel to myself, you little know-it-all. Don't get me wrong, I'm not outraged that God was depicted as a child, to be honest. That's fine, it's an interesting artistic decision. Yes, it might denigrate the divine wisdom and omnipotence of God, but I was willing to give the child God character a go. That is until a couple of seconds into his dialogue, where I began to realize he is the most petulant, wrathful character of the film. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's kind of that lack of depth there with the majority of this film, and that kind of irritated me. However, as far as biblical inconsistencies go, I was okay with the film for the most part. In the book of Exodus, all we read is that the river turned red. So this depiction of those monstrous crocodiles eating everything and anything, including each other, the savagery of that whole scene, I found that to be pretty competent, pretty adept. That was cool. Furthermore, the whole plague sequence of the film was done really well, I felt. It was just horrifying, disgusting, terrible things going on there, creating this nauseating atmosphere. During this portion of the film, I couldn't help but feel to myself just how terrifying is the idea of omnipotence and the power of God. Also, a nice little tidbit throughout the film, it was shown that Ramses was constantly eating, which was a nice little touch I felt. It displays his wealth and lavish provision whilst the people he is enslaved are persecuted. Also a note about Ramses, I always imagine the book of Exodus to push this king to be relentlessly anxious and the plague to be undermining his power and weigh heavily on him. And I think there was a bit of that within the film, which was quite nice. Moving on with this idea of characterization, Ramses was always wearing gold colors whilst Moses was always wearing black. That was interesting to see. In their final clash, Ramses rode on a white horse whilst Moses rode on a Black Horse. Christian Bale's Moses throughout this whole film kind of resonated as this shadowy, threatening man. That was pretty cool to see. I'm a big fan of Bale, and whilst his acting ability isn't entirely showcased throughout this film, it was still definitely appreciated, and it was still apparent. There's also this theme of brotherhood and kinship between Ramses and Moses throughout the film, but I won't go into that too heavily. Interestingly, both Moses and Ramses survived at the end of the film, as though they both had to live with the consequence of submitting to their respective higher powers. Ramses' god was himself, Moses' god was that belligerent young boy. I feel like I should address the ending sequence of the film, as I'm sure its contrasting take on the crossing of the seas might have upset a few people. I felt pretty ambivalent about it myself. The waters kind of dissipate for a time as Moses and the others cross, as opposed to, the staff, or in this case I guess the sword, being stabbed into the ground and splitting the ocean into two walls of water. You would think that for a big blockbuster film, two walls of sea would be a pretty big, epic final act for this film. Moses riding back to stare Ramses in the eye before they were both engulfed by the water was kind of to me. The whole epic tension as the water is returning. It was just a bit of a silly movie moment. Overall, I wasn't outraged or offended by this film, and it did maintain some cinematic girth, with moments such as the depiction of the plagues. However, ultimately I found it to be lacking in the emotional and spiritual side of things. It was careful to not make its audience uncomfortable with the whole "this is a story about God from the Bible" aspect. Kind of the elephant in the room. However, this attempt at impartial sensitivity might have actually hurt the film. Exodus and the Noah movie this year open up some interesting pathways for potential future films based off of Bible stories. Admittedly, it is a polarizing effort to put out a film such as this, but as far as I'm concerned, as long as it draws curiosity to the Christian narrative, that's a good thing. Even if there are inaccuracies and inadequacies, blockbuster films generating interest in the Bible and theological matters as a whole is a good thing, and I would say we should be satisfied that at least this movie was produced and is out there for people to see. I'm Duncan, this is Unity Reviews, thank you for watching.